Welcome once again to these studies in the Good News or the Gospel written by Mark, a companion of Jesus and his friends. Today we're considering together Mark chapter 9 verses 43 to 50. Mark records the words of Jesus at this point when he said, and I quote, "If your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. It's better for you to enter life maimed than with two hands to go into hell, where the fire never goes out. And if your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life crippled than to have 2 feet and be thrown into hell. And if your eye causes you to stumble, pluck it out. It's better for you to enter the kingdom of God with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and be thrown into hell, where the worms that eat them do not die, the fire is not quenched. Everyone will be salted with fire. Salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can you make it salty again? Have salt among yourselves, and be at peace with one another." This all seems rather a grim message. But before I seek to explain it, I would like to remind us all of what Mark has already told us. He is convinced and wants to convince us that Jesus was the person that God had promised for many centuries, the one who would sort out the mess into which humanity had got itself through rebellion against God, and was the one who himself was God incarnate, or God united with a human being. Amazing, even unbelievable. But Mark has tried to provide us with eyewitness accounts of Jesus' life and teaching that he thinks show that this claim is not so absurd as it might at first sound. Now, Mark is still interested in proving who Jesus was and is, but following Jesus' own lead, he has increasingly been asking the question, just what is involved in accepting Jesus' message and becoming one of his followers? So Mark spends less time describing Jesus' miraculous ministry and far more time recording Jesus' teaching to his little band of followers. And in the previous passage we studied together, Jesus sought to teach his disciples a vital lesson. They have an obligation to encourage and nurture those who are genuinely seeking to follow Jesus. In particular, they are to be wary of those wrongful attitudes that they might entertain that can place obstacles in the way of the spiritual growth of others. The present passage then continues this theme. All too often Christians fail here. So there's a real challenge to those of us who call ourselves Christians, but there's also an implication for those who might be interested in following Jesus. They will, of course, find some very poor examples of so-called disciples of Jesus. And these people can discourage us from becoming disciples ourselves. But Jesus warns us of this possibility and invites us to look past such bad examples to him and what he actually taught. Meanwhile, Jesus' warnings to those who claim to be his disciples but fail to put his teaching into practice and become obstacles to others following him is quite deliberately lurid. What he says is, in his view, of absolutely vital importance. We need, therefore, to listen intently to the 3 things that he says here. First of all, he makes the point that being poor disciples can lead those who claim to be following him to personal disaster. Did you notice that 3 times in this short section we read together, Jesus refers to a failure that leads to hell. A hell that he then describes as a place where, to quote him, the worms that eat them do not die and the fire is not quenched, and everyone will be salted with fire. Now, Jesus is clearly using picture language here. This is probably not literally what hell is like. However, using language that his hearers and we understand, Jesus' point is that hell is very different from heaven. Above all, it is a place where the consequences of disobedience against God are a painful and inescapable reality, and where, very simply, God is himself absent. There could surely be no more effective way of stressing the vital importance of doing all that is possible to nurture the emerging spiritual growth of others. The lives of disciples must be magnets which draw people forward into faith rather than those that repel. In the latter case, such persons are not disciples at all, but hell-bent rebels against God, rebels who have utterly failed to obey his call to be attractive witnesses to him. The second point that Jesus makes is that getting things right may require painful self-surgery by his followers. Again, the language of self-mutilation is not to be taken literally, but is quite deliberately harsh. The point that Jesus makes is surely that what is demanded of good disciples does not come natural to us. Radical and painful surgery may be necessary to remove those things that cause others to stumble and turn away from Jesus. It is interesting to explore the possible things that Jesus might have had in mind and to see how it might apply to us today. The disciples' discussion in the previous section of Mark's account suggests that personal ambition can constitute a very real problem. Central to this is pride, the supreme vice. To live humbly does not come easily to any of us. We want to do things our way, in our time, and as best suits us. We want to put ourselves at the centre of all we do. To turn such an attitude and its consequences on its head is tough, very tough. But it is what Jesus demands. He was humble, and he wants to win others to become his followers through others who reflect his humility and are peace-loving, just as he himself was. John's question in the previous passage demonstrates why this is difficult. A secular worldview invariably promotes a very different way of evaluating self-worth and success. But this is divisive and makes it difficult to live at peace with one another. Each of us, if we're not careful, are driven by selfish ambition and climb over others to achieve our own selfish goals. And our world nurtures all the time such attitudes. Jesus tells his disciples they need to watch out. Finally and thirdly, Jesus ends his teaching here by offering 3 challenges. Let's remind ourselves what he said. Everyone will be salted with fire. Salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can you make it salty again? Have salt among yourselves and be at peace with each other. Firstly then, to rub salt into a wound can be excruciatingly painful, as many of us know. And yet without its purifying and cleansing effects, a wound can become infected and disease-ridden. So, says Jesus, discipleship was never intended to be an easy ride. If the demands made by him seem great, what else is to be expected in the pursuit of a healthy purity that reflects God himself and wins others to be his disciples? So secondly, he warns all disciples or potential disciples against the danger of a zeal and a devotion to him becoming insipid. When salt is admixed with other things, it loses its astringent qualities and is useless, or worse, it can neither purify and heal and may only make an infection worse. Finally, Jesus emphasizes the importance of disciples living humbly and peaceably with one another. In some ways, this is what we might call the acid test. If we claim to be Jesus' disciples and live alone, we may like to think that we are humble and peaceable. But it's when we have to love out of our lives with others that problems arise. It's there, so Jesus implies, that the genuineness of the salt having got to work in purifying and healing our hearts is to be truly witnessed. I never fail to be surprised by the fact that those who claim to be disciples of Jesus seem so readily willing to ignore his teaching and pervert true Christianity. But then I shouldn't be surprised if I know my own heart. So this passage where Jesus has the multiplication of his disciples in view is a big challenge. Only true Christianity, to be seen in a humble submission to Jesus, willing to suffer the consequences of his healing methods, and peaceable and winsome, will enable such a multiplication to take place. And where his disciples fail to live in such a way, they reveal that they're not really his followers, and their destiny is not to enjoy the delights of fellowship with God in his heavenly kingdom, but to suffer the far more painful consequences of having rebelled against the living and the loving God.